Paul Walker kept a secret for years, and it had nothing to do with Hollywood. Not the franchise that made his name known across every continent. Not the contracts, not the public persona stitched together from natural charisma and the sound of engines pushed past comfortable limits. The secret was a garage in Valencia, California, loaded with more than 30 cars that almost nobody had ever seen. Each one purchased quietly, stored carefully, and held through corporate structures designed to keep them away from public records entirely. When his family opened those doors in the weeks following his death in November 2013, what waited inside told a story that had never been scripted, never been shared, and was never meant for anyone else to find. Most of the world knew Brian O'Connor, the undercover law enforcement officer who could thread a muscle car through dense traffic at triple digits and make it look effortless. What they didn't know was that the man playing that character genuinely lived inside that world, not because the franchise demanded it, not because the cameras were rolling, but because speed and steel had become his private language long before a single frame of those films was ever shot. His garage wasn't a showroom built to impress visitors. It was a working shop, a personal vault, and an ongoing record of everything he'd been building in private when nobody was around to see it. When estate attorneys and family members began cataloging the contents, the first thing that overwhelmed them wasn't the monetary value, it was the scale. Row after row of covered machines filled a large industrial space, some half-assembled, others barely road legal, and a handful carrying no titles whatsoever. The collection's total estimated value came in above $18 million. A 1995 BMW M3 Lightweight sat among them, one of fewer than 130 ever produced, and Paul reportedly owned 5 of them. A Celine S7 occupied nearby floor space, one of the rarest American hypercars ever built. Ford GTs, multiple Porsche 911s, and a Toyota Supra Turbo completed a lineup that most serious collectors spend entire careers trying to assemble. None of those cars, though, carried the weight of what came next. The Skylines told a completely different story. Paul's relationship with Nissan Skyline GTRs went well past fandom or investment. Several R32 and R34 GTRs had been imported through private channels, tuned by hand, and tracked through handwritten logs recording alignment angles, RPM shift points, and tire response from individual track sessions. One R34, widely believed by those close to the production to be directly connected to the Fast and Furious franchise, had been kept in private storage completely untouched, which meant the public had never once laid eyes on it. Some of these Skylines entered the U.S. through the show and display exemption, a narrow legal designation that allows non-compliant foreign vehicles to cross the border for exhibition purposes, though it restricts how often and under what conditions they can be operated. At least one reportedly carried incomplete federal paperwork. Paul had personally funded legal efforts to get specific GTRs cleared through U.S. Customs, and people in his inner circle said he genuinely believed he was clearing a path for other enthusiasts who wanted the same machines without stripping away the engineering purity that made them worth wanting. None of these cars were registered in his personal name. Most were held through Always Evolving, the motorsport and tuning company Paul co-founded with Roger Rodas, who died beside him in that same crash in November 2013. Always Evolving operated as both a legitimate high-performance shop and a vehicle holding structure, keeping the full scope of the collection away from any public record. And that's when the legal complications began accumulating. After both men died, determining who actually owned which vehicle became a dispute nobody had prepared for. Some titles were split between personal and corporate ownership. Others were still pending federal modification approvals. Several had been consigned for future private sale, and others were already set aside for charity auctions that never took place. Creditors surfaced. Former business associates filed claims against the estate. What had begun as a private collection built from genuine obsession turned into an $18 million legal dispute, managed by Paul's father as a state executor, with his daughter Meadow named as the primary heir. Meadow was 15 years old when she lost him. Going through those cars was not a clean or neutral inventory exercise for anyone involved, because every vehicle held something her father had touched, chosen, or left sitting mid-build without any expectation of not coming back. That's exactly where the garage stopped being a collection and became something harder to categorize. Inside glove boxes, center consoles, and hidden compartments throughout the space, the estate team kept pulling out handwritten notes, not just tuning data, though there was plenty of that, but personal messages written with no audience in mind and no plan for anyone else to ever read them. One note found inside an R34 Skyline read, "Feels like flying, smooth, angry, alive." A message jammed into the center armrest of the BMW M3 Lightweights said simply, "Might be the cleanest one left, don't ever flip it." And inside one of the GTRs, in blue ink on a small sticky note, came 6 words that reportedly stopped people mid-step. "This one's for Meadow. She'll drive it one day." None of it had been staged for effect. These were the remnants of a man who wrote things down when a car or a moment moved him, the way people do when there is no audience and nothing to prove. Walking through that garage felt, to those who had known Paul closely, less like an appraisal and more like reading someone's private journal without their permission, page by page, and not being able to stop. Several of the cars weren't functional when the estate team arrived. A Datsun 240Z had been stripped entirely to the shell and was believed to be his next personal project. A 1960s American muscle car sat mid-restoration, reportedly being built as a gift for a close friend. Masking tape labels carrying hand-drawn to-do lists still clung to dashboards. Tools sat beside open bays exactly where he'd left them. Paul wasn't hiring specialists to restore these machines for future resale. He was doing the work himself, spending hours under lifts and inside engine bays because the act of building something from nothing mattered more to him than any finished result. Friends remembered him losing entire afternoons in that shop, hands covered in grease, debating exhaust configurations or running wiring harnesses with the focus of someone who had nowhere else he'd rather be. Scattered across the collection were vehicles with yellow sticky notes marked RO or Charity Auction, ROWW. Reach Out Worldwide, the nonprofit disaster relief organization Paul founded in 2010, had been quietly receiving his planning and resources long before anyone in his professional circle was aware of it. A modified 1993 Toyota Supra, one that had never appeared on screen, carried one of those tags. A Boss 302 Mustang had a handwritten note attached with specific instructions for a charity event that never got to happen. These were not tribute arrangements made by the family after his death. They were plans Paul had already set into motion, specific cars allocated to fund disaster relief operations before the accident changed everything. The people who found those tags said it was among the hardest things to absorb, not because it was theatrical, but because it was so completely, quietly consistent with everything else the garage was revealing about him. 21 vehicles were eventually sent to Barrett-Jackson in Arizona, auctioned publicly in 2020, and bringing in just over $2.3 million combined. Not everything made it to the public auction floor. Some cars were privately negotiated away, others stayed within the family. The legal disputes over valuation and ownership stretched on for years, pulling what had been a deeply personal collection through a slow machinery of court filings, estate categorizations, and financial settlements. For the people who loved Paul, that process carried a specific kind of grief, not because the money was ultimately the point, but because watching his private devotion to these machines reduced to asset columns and dispute exhibits felt like something being taken from him a second time over. What the garage ultimately revealed wasn't a celebrity hobby wrapped in corporate paperwork or a collection built to be discovered and admired. It was the portrait of someone who had worked out exactly who he was long before a film franchise gave him a global platform, and who spent his private hours inhabiting that identity with no cameras present and no audience required. He didn't collect to display. He collected to understand, to build, and to set things aside for the people he cared about. That sticky note meant for Meadow wasn't a dramatic gesture toward legacy. It was a father quietly reserving something for his daughter, the same way he appeared to do everything in that garage, without performance, without an audience, and without it needing to be witnessed by anyone else to matter. The radio in one of his Porsches was still set to his last station when the estate team turned on the ignition. His tools were arranged exactly as he'd left them, And in a corner of that garage, beside a half-finished build that will never be completed, a car sat with a yellow tag and a name written in his handwriting. Not for auction, not for any legal proceeding, just for her.